Hi everybody. Coming up to New Year, or in Russian, s Novым годом. But we're not there yet. This is Friday, the 29th. And I'm uploading, I sincerely hope, my first bedtime breather story. So here goes. I hope you like it. This is Bedtime Breathers number 1. BARB. A dictionary. Barb, a sharp projection near the end of an arrow, fishhook, or similar object, which is angled away from the main point so as to make extraction difficult. A cluster of spikes on barbed wire. A deliberately hurtful remark. His barb hurt more than she cared to admit. Was it 4, or was it 4.5 billion years ago? It could not remember. But somewhere in the darkest, coldest recesses of this entity's mindful recollections was the original image of its own creation. It had been able to hook onto a piece of rock, so it deduced, and had prevented itself from being flung far out into space one more time. It had absolutely no idea how it had been able to cling to the piece of rock, but it had not concerned itself with trying to remember, nor trying to comprehend how. It was irrelevant. It had no real understanding of the passage of time, but had very slowly, over countless millennia, begun to realize that it had been almost dormant in its own environment, without interference from any outside agency or influences during the entirety of its being. It was therefore quite old, in fact, but yet simply a youngster in galactic terms. How had it survived? What did it consume, if it did at all consume anything? Where exactly had been its tomb, its abode, its lair, its haunt? It had never needed to catch any prey, as it had never known about feeding. It had never questioned its physical existence on this space dross, if indeed this was what the planet was. It seemed to gradually realize that now it had become reliant upon this evolving rock, but had not needed any sustenance from its surroundings. Until now. It had started feeling a need to add to itself, to feed itself, to acquire additional material to increase its mass. But from where? It commenced studying its surroundings, yet not using sight as we know it, but with a form of infrared signals bouncing off different substances, in some ways not unlike a bat, which uses sonic signals, a little bit like radar. It decided to explore its environment in order to learn more about its own habitat, before committing itself to any one particular course of action. It needed to understand more of what it had been, what it actually was, where it was, and what it needed to become, as it had an underlying built-in fear of loss of self. It had no understanding of its own form, size, or shape, and had no knowledge gained or implanted in itself, or information with respect as to how it could engage in acquiring sustenance. It had no knowledge of what a mouth might have been, or a throat, or innards that humans would use to keep themselves in a living state, if that was its real state. All it had was this urge to start foraging in order for it to increase its own mass. It had no eyes, it had no ears, yet it understood sound. It had no concept of light and dark, as its own entity had originated in a different solar system, possibly even a different galaxy, according to its information, or lack thereof, it had absolutely no idea, nor any wish to know. It dwelt upon the information that it currently owned, but its thought processes were as slow as a cooled lava flow. It took perhaps 1 billion years to come to the realization that it actually had self, and gradually acquired a greater understanding of its own environment, which had heated up through the actions of compression and frictions of other materials and rocks, making the entire conglomeration taking the form of a spheroid. This process, in turn, began creating the molten heat engine that became the first building blocks of life. So it was assumed by modern humans. In other words, the first positive modifications of the environment of the planet upon which it existed had started. Prior to that, it had been the only life form in existence on the myriads of rock pieces that gradually coalesced into this orbiting, revolving, and rotating lump. So what was it? Was it a warm-blooded entity, or similar to that state that certain reptiles have in existence today that we call cold-blooded? Or was it permanently as cold as its surrounding rocks and firmament? Did its internal temperature vary? It did not know. It was not bothered either. Even if it had been capable of speech, it could not have described itself, as it had no understanding of its own form, shape, or design. It also had no idea at all of why it was there, or even what it was. It didn't care. It just knew that it had to hunt, to find some sustenance, to sustain its existence, and to grow. As this particular individual lump of rock aged and slowly metamorphosed into a form that was less inhospitable than its first billion years of existence, so the entity began to transubstantiate itself from its original form into a highly, slightly intelligent, specifically driven entity. It gained the realization of need. The following few million years encouraged it to gain an understanding of want. Still more millennia beyond, it began to develop a feeling of power. Concupiscence was not in its understanding, but control over other materials and states began to modify its unusual and rather individual state of being. The state could be construed as a very basic form of consciousness, but without conscience. It very slowly began to develop a sense of individuality, a sense of being a unique entity, a sense of superiority over all its surrounding materials. The revolving and rotating rock, now in its 4th billion year of existence, continued evolving and providing environments for a growing variety of odd and unusual single-cell beings. This sphere of rocky materials, with new minuscule microorganisms, unknowingly continued upon its unending course, receiving energy from a star some 93 million miles distant from itself, but was held in place through the fierce gravitational force exerted by this yellow-white star, Sol. Even the continued evolution continued to take place into the 5th billion year of its existence, and through many hundreds of millions of years, animal life blossomed and branched, providing tremendous resources to the lump of rock in the form of fats, oils, and many other trace metals and salts, enriching the planet's ability to maintain individual life forms in both a watery environment as well as a dry land environment. It was during the last wisps of change, thus affecting the rotating and revolving lump of rock, that the final iteration of life form was able to exist for a fraction of the time in the life of the lump of rock. These were so-called humans. How flimsy this life form was. Humans were soft-fleshed, fickle and short-lived life forms, sporting an internal liquid reservoir of sweet-tasting molecules. These were easily accessed by puncturing any part of the dermis and reducing the external pressure slightly, thereby causing this sticky liquid to pass through the surface of the dermis, into whichever receptacle was being used for this purpose. Okay, that's the end of part 1. Part 2, in the new year. But I hope you like it. Bye for now.